on the table. And of course, that was Union Oil. But just like any other family who spent generations in California, our story isn't much different from everyone else's. And here to tell a wonderful story is John Mack Faragher. Come on out, Johnny. Hello.
Hi, Mike.
So John Mack Faragher is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University, Professor Emeritus, I may add. He served as the director of the Lamar Center for the Study of Frontiers and Borders. He has written many books, including Women and Men on the Overland Trail, Sugar Creek, Life on the Illinois Prairie, and the American West, A New Interpretive History. His book about Daniel Boone won the Los Angeles Times Award for biography. So he's had a wonderful career, and we're very pleased to talk to you about your latest book. I was wondering, how did this idea come about that you wanted to do it? Because you grew up in California, didn't you?
I did. I grew up in Southern California, went to public school, got a bachelor's degree at University of California, Riverside. Did a couple of years. I was a social worker for LA County right before I went to graduate school.
Interesting, but you've always been a California at heart, even though you've been at it in Connecticut, which we are now at heart.
Yeah, one of the strange facts of American culture is that I came east to study the West. A place like Yale University has one of the best collections of Western Americana in the country, collected by wealthy Yale men early in the 20th century. That's where the collection started. And so for Yale had a program, and then I was happy to continue that program later in my career of training historians in the history of the American West, borderlands, frontiers, settler colonialism. Those are topics that Yale has been taking up for many years. And so I went to Yale to study with Howard Lamar, who was director of that program then, and then later became Howard Lamar Professor, much to my honor.
Wow, and I'm sure he was very pleased for you as well.
Howard is still alive and kicking, and he's approaching 100 years old. But he still spends his time reading the newest history books on the American West.
Oh, that's great. And did you read yours? Obviously.
I haven't heard from him yet. So when he has, I will get a phone call for sure.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about your book in a little bit. First, I wanted to open up as far as you yourself. Were you always interested in history when you were a child or younger? How did you make this your life's work? Was it something that happened?
When I went to college, I thought I was going to be a physics major. I'd had a wonderful physics teacher in high school, and as teachers can do, I want to be like him. So. And it took me about 2 weeks to realize I was not cut out to be a physics major. And at the same time, I had a wonderful humanities class. This is back in the day when every freshman took this. We all had the same curriculum. You had to take a full year of humanities, which was really Western civilization. And it just, we were basically reading documents and trying to figure out ideas, and it was a total turn on for me. And I never looked back. Now I did, after graduation, went into social work. It was 1968, 69. But that was maybe a little too intense for me. I would go home and try to calm myself down by reading history. Finally, I realized I probably should take that interest and try to turn it into a career. So I went to graduate school. And long story short, here I am.
How many years did you work in social work then?
2.5 years, something like that. a very
Okay.
intense time, 1968, 1969,
Yeah.
in Watts Willowbrook. Yeah,
Okay.
it was it was a time to remember. I don't regret a minute of it. I learned about the
Well, you
world
lived the 60s, obviously.
very much so.
And as far as which is something you cover in your book, but were there any seminal moments that you really stuck out in your mind in that during that period?
Gee, I mean, there's so many of them, but I think for all of us, all of the family, my family and friends, the signal events of the '60s, which was my college decade, um,
Mm,
was the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam. And
mhm,
those two things fundamentally shaped who I am. Uh,
mhm,
you know, I feel like my values were really forged in those controversies. Uh,
mm,
and so when I decided to do history, one of the things that resulted in that was that I wanted to do a history of ordinary people. I was convinced that, well, as actually one of my characters in the California book says, the remedy for democracy is more democracy. And
mhm.
it felt like the history I was reading was too much elite history and not enough history of ordinary
Ah,
people and the way they had shaped events. And so that
mhm,
really became my dedication. My first book was uh, about women and men on the Overland Trail, which was an attempt to try to figure out how the Western experience, which was typically seen as a male thing, how that was
mhm.
perceived by women as well as men. And that really sort of struck a bell. And uh, that's the kind of history I've done for my whole career.
Mhm. And through that reflected through your teaching as
Oh,
well,
yes, very
correct?
much so. I very much in my teaching, yes.
Mhm. But now you're a full-time writer and you've created this wonderful book. Congratulations, by the way. It really
Thank you.
is. It's very and it's funny because it's about a little over 400 pages. It's very packed, but it doesn't feel like it's packed.
Well, good. I'm
But
glad.
you covered everything. And I want to know, how did you decide to write this book for people like me who are not academics to be able to ingest and enjoy, as opposed to writing an academic book? How did this idea come about?
Sure, sure. Uh, well, I have to give Yale University Press a good deal of credit because they
Mhm.
proposed this kind of book to me.
Ah,
It's a book that, in the intention when they came to me and
mhm,
asked if I would be interested in writing a book that was aimed at a general audience, in fact, at a young adult audience, perhaps. A book
mhm,
that could be accessible to high school students, college students, as well as full-grown adults. That would
mhm,
not have footnotes, that would not have a bibliography, that would be narrative and focus on ordinary people, uh, and moreover, that it would have very short chapters and very many of them. So this book has
mhm.
40 chapters, but no
Yeah.
chapter is longer than several pages. So the whole idea there is to uh, allow the reader to enjoy the chapter and then put the book down maybe and pick it up again
Mhm,
later and read another chapter and not feel like you have to. I hate it when you have to end your reading in the middle of a chapter. And
mhm,
if you can, with the length of these chapters, I think you can easily read a chapter before bed, or
mhm,
book sits on the nightstand, or you. So the whole idea was to facilitate its reading enjoyment by ordinary people.
mhm. But since you wrote it with a little bit of with a progressive bent, and there are times
I'm a
that it
progressive
made me
person.
angry. Well, it made me angry, not your writing, I should say, but the content of the people who are involved with this. So, I couldn't read it before bed. I'll just tell you that.
Okay, fair
But
enough.
you you wrote it in a way. It was chronological, and there's a reason behind writing it as opposed to several. People can read it whichever the way they want, but there's a reason why you wrote it a certain way. Correct?
Yeah, it's all very
In the
deliberate. Yes.
Yes, but I think you explained that in your introduction, page 7, or I believe it is, where you start about how you put it together and why you did it the way you did. If you don't mind reading that part,
I'd be
I would
happy to,
love to hear your
Michael.
voice read. Thank you.
I'd be happy to. So this is from chapter 1, the end of chapter 1. Understanding the histories of the diverse places and peoples of California requires an imaginative leap back in time. That's something many people find difficult to do. Historical thinking does not come naturally. We focus intently on the present and the future, making it hard to imagine a past that extends back hundreds of years. To make sense of a period of time far longer than a human lifespan, we need to see the past in sequence. Understanding the order in which events take place is the key to unlocking the cause and effect of history. Thinking historically also requires historical empathy, the attempt to understand the thoughts, feelings, and actions of those who lived before us. They were like us in many ways. They lived and loved, worked and played, fought and died. Yet they were also very different from us. They laughed at jokes that today mystify us. They cherished values we find difficult to understand. They worshipped in ways that may seem strange and exotic. The British historian G.M. Trevelyan expressed this beautifully. The poetry of history lies in the quasi-miraculous fact that once on this earth, once on this familiar spot of ground, walked other men and women, as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, now all gone. One generation vanishing after another, gone as utterly as we ourselves shall shortly be gone, like ghosts at cockcrow. So here's a little thought experiment to kickstart your historical thinking. As a way of measuring historical distance and ordering it in sequence, imagine the past as a chain stretching back through time, generation preceding generation. Many of us have been fortunate enough to know at least one of our grandparents. They can tell us about people and events that took place 50, 60, 70 years ago, long before we were born. A grandmother might even tell stories she heard from her own grandmother, which would take us back 4 generations, more than a century. Yet many of those stories will have the ring of immediacy, echoing the experience, thoughts, and feelings of people who have long since passed away. Try imagining the world of your grandmother's childhood, and then the world of her grandmother's childhood. And then compound that leap to your grandmother's 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 grandmother. That takes us back 10 generations to where this history of California begins.
Wow, that'll entice people to want to read your book. It's funny. I was just going through some old photos. When I read that, I was going through my old great grandfather's photos because they came over in the 1850s, the Chinese side, and I would come across like documents like this and photos of my great great grandfather, and I with them in mind, I had that voice. I was listening to that voice while I was reading your book. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Um, Over your or I'd say the first 100 page, maybe, let me think about this. I was looking at page numbers, which I don't normally do, but about half of your book, I would say, focuses on the time before California became a state.
That's right.
And it not only shows the importance of the state, but there were so many different stories, and they were also key and necessary. And I was wondering, how are you able to put all of that together? Because that's 100 years of pretty much prehistory, because nothing was really written down at that time. And how were you able to put that part together?
Well, a couple of things about that. I mean, you're very perceptive, taking the book apart like that, because again, that was another very deliberate strategy on my part. Mm-hmm. I was bound and determined. I mean, one of the things that I generally do early American history. My biography of Daniel Boone is basically about the Revolution. I've written about the 19th century, and my Acadian book is about the 18th century. And talk to any early American historian, and they're going to begin to gripe about how our period doesn't get equal coverage. And of course, it's understandable that the pressing issues of the present and the immediate past overwhelm everything else. But when you allow that to happen, you miss the longue durée, as they say, the long past history. And that long history can sometimes reveal things that we lose sight of in the short term. And I can give you examples of that, but so I was bound and determined to be halfway through the book before I got to the Americanization of California, because there's much more to the story than just American California. There's, the Spanish began exploring California in the 16th century, and they didn't mount a colonization expedition until the 18th century. And yet, so native people had contact with Europeans in one way or another for almost 200 years before the Spanish even began to colonize California. And there were all kinds of contacts, and most of them we know nothing about because they were unrecorded. We know some of them, and they can be taken as representative of many others that must have happened. It's often California history, or any colonial history, is the colonizers appear and history begins. In fact, the way it actually happened was people are going about their lives, and suddenly someone is there, and then they're gone, and they might not be back for another generation or two, and so there's no memory of it. These are like fleeting encounters, and yet these fleeting encounters were all very significant in that they told of what was to come. One of my favorite examples is one of the Spanish expeditions, the first one where men left the ship and began to try to explore the countryside. And we believe that this was at Morro Bay.
That's right.
So this ship was a Manila galleon. It was on its way to Mexico from Manila, and they stopped along the California coast because they thought they needed a place of refuge. And this captain was searching for such a place where they could have a base. And they boarded the ship and they started exploring. They ran into some native women. And then they went further back into the countryside. And I say in the book, imagine the scene, because the so-called Spaniards, number one, they were mestizos from Mexico. They were, the children of Spaniards and Mexican natives, and they were dressed in chainmail armor, and they were accompanied by an equal number of Filipinos who were dressed in, sort of loincloths and carrying spears. so this was the Spanish Entrada. It was mestizos
Yeah.
and Filipinos, and they got into a fight with the Chumash, who are native to the Santa Barbara area.
Yeah.
So this was one of the first encounters. And of course, it's a story that's not ever told, and yet it contains all kinds of truthful incidents that point the way to what's going to happen in California. You know, the multicultural character and ethnic people. These are all people of color, right? Filipinos, mestizos, Chumash. They're all people of what we would call people of color, and they're fighting each other in this very early encounter. So the only thing we really don't know in the world is what happened before we were here. You know, that's the job of the historian. Tell us these tales. So the idea here was that there's a lot of history to be recovered and understood and narrated before the Americans ever got to California, and that was one of my intents. Now, so that gave me a lot of time, a lot of chapters, 20 chapters basically, to tell this early story. Then on the other hand, it gave me 20 chapters where I had to compress in a whole century of, you know, basically the mid-19th century to the 21st century, 150 years. And that was that was difficult. But that had some, you know, having to compress the modern story, I think also I found liberating, and that it helped me to search for larger patterns and find characters who could stand for those larger patterns.
Yes. You know, there are so many interesting parts of that first part, though. I mean, the Russians at Fort Ross and the large population of Californians prior to European intervention, I should say. And how many Native Americans, Native Californians were living in California prior to the European incursion?
So, you know, these are all estimates. You know, there's no census, and anthropologists have various ways, demographers have various ways of figuring these out, and I'm not one of them. I only go by what they tell us. But I think the current accepted estimate is that pre-colonial population in California would be about 250,000. Now that is that would make California the largest region of North America north of Mexico. Of course, you know, the Mexican highlands and Tenochtitlan, which becomes Mexico City, you know, teeming millions there. But in what's now the United States, the region with the largest number of Native people was California. And in fact, there are 109, last count, unless I've missed one in the last year or so, 109 recognized bands of California natives, which makes that California the state with the largest number of federally recognized bands or tribes. And that's because there were so many Native Californians and divided into relatively small communities. I call them little countries. With, you know, because California is such a, as you were mentioning, such a diverse place geographically. You know, there are, I don't remember now how many, but hundreds of habitats in the state, distinctive habitats. And Native people learn to use all of those habitats, you know, in a variety of different ways. You know, so now just to put that in perspective, 250,000, let's say in 1770, when the Spanish arrived, 1769, 1770. By 1845, the estimate is that that population has fallen to about 150,000. So the loss of 100,000 people over the 50 years, under 75 years of Spanish-Mexican colonization. But then from 1845 to 1860, the population of Native Californians is estimated to have fallen from 150,000 to 35,000. And during that period, the 1850s and 60s, the state of California waged a deliberate campaign of what was called extermination against Californians. So, as Governor Newsom said a year or so ago, we need to call that by its proper name, and that's called genocide.
Yeah. Wow. That 15, that's like 15% of what it was before colonization of the
Yes.
native population. That's just incredible.
And of course, that was not even the nadir. It fell further by 1900. Now, the population has rebounded in the 20th century, but this means that it's the loss of generational memory, the loss of cultural tradition, the loss of language. These are the consequences of that kind of genocide. Now, at the same time, it should be acknowledged that Native Californians have not only survived, but they have adapted and accommodated themselves to this new environment, so that Native Californians are very much a presence in the state. They're not invisible. Anybody who travels around the state sees plenty of evidence that Native Californians are still there, and they're still active, and they're powerful, and they're politically powerful, as it should be, because they are our native inhabitants of the state. So, we oughtn't to let the fact of the terrible fact of genocide cloud the triumph of Native people in their ability to survive and adapt, and to return to their cultural roots. I think that's just, to me, that is a story that I think is very uplifting.
Yeah. It's funny, I remember you writing, though, that the so popular notion of Native Americans withering away just didn't wash. I mean, it was obvious that they were exterminated.
Right. Well,
but
that's how you actually raise a really interesting point, because the withering away, as you put it, or what they would say in the 19th century, the vanishing. The vanishing Indian. And that's an ideology. And that ideology is one that it allows the man with the gun to say, see, it's all natural. And it allows the man with the conscience to say, there's nothing I could do about it. It gives an out to both sides. It gives an out to both the reactionary racist and the good-hearted liberal. And so everybody bought into the vanishing Indian idea, because it served everybody's interests, except Native people, of course. People are saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it, while the state of California is funding, they're voting funds for militias to go out and kill Native people.
Oh, yeah, I know. Yeah. So it was very convenient for them to believe in a narrative that was made up.
That's right. Very, 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 very true.
So actually, a viewer, go ahead and keep typing your questions in. Wanted to know, what role did the missions have in the reduction of Native Californian population?
Really good question, and a controversial one. As it turns out, practically everything about the missions is controversial these days. Just a word of definition. Of course, California was colonized by Spain, and the mission was the colonizing agency. What was the mission? What was the task of the missions? It was to organize the native labor force, through conversion and training. So Native people were proselytized, and those who agreed to be baptized became Christian converts, and
Mhm.
then their labor was put to use in basically supporting the colony. The colony of
Okay.
California would not have survived except for Indian labor. Indian labor, native labor, was the labor that kept the colony operating. So this was the way the system worked. The missions converted native people from their own mode of production into a kind of plantation mode of production, and that
Mm.
supported the colonial enterprise in California, and also supported a military establishment, which was fed and provisioned by native labor in the missions. Now, one of the
Mhm.
things about the missions was that they began in Mexico. Father Serra, who
Mhm.
Father Juan Serra, who was the head of the Franciscan Mission Program in California, had already been the head of the Franciscan Mission Program in Baja California. And the missionaries knew full
Mhm.
well that the impact of the missions on native people was that they transmitted disease and native people died. And
Mm.
they died in extraordinary numbers. And mostly these deaths were the mortality affected young people, so that children did not survive. The survival
Wow.
rate, the childhood survival rate was very low. So in most of the missions, and I think this is true for all of them that have records sufficient to provide for demographic study,
Mhm.
all of the missions, when they became mature institutions, were unable to reproduce themselves. That is to say, there were more deaths than there were births
Mhm.
in the missions. And this was
Mhm.
because of disease, perhaps because of nutritional deprivation. That's harder to prove. The disease is clear, it's clear in the record. Uh, much of that disease also, I must say, was sexually transmitted diseases introduced by the Spanish soldiers who were
Mhm.
notoriously abusive of native women. That's
Mhm.
another aspect you see over and over again
Mhm.
when native people rise up at the missions in revolt or resistance. It's nearly always over an issue of the mistreatment, usually sexual mistreatment of women.
Mhm.
And that sexual abuse introduced sexually transmitted diseases into the population, which were
Mhm.
devastating. So
Mhm.
none of the missions were able to reproduce themselves. They were all die institutions. The only way they were able to
Wow.
survive was to go out and find new converts and bring them in. Uh, the,
Mhm.
the, the intention was that they would become parish churches with villagers who would,
Mhm.
be reproducing, but it never worked that way because of disease.
Mhm. Well, even though Father Sarah, did not espouse the massacring, he was his through his patriarchal figure, he was not above delivering punishment.
Franciscans, and they were not alone among
Yeah.
Christian orders uh, who believed in the power of pain. And
Mhm.
Sarah himself, he flagellated himself every night before
Yeah,
he went to
that's
sleep.
what.
Uh, and what's good for me is good for you, he would think. So corporal punishment was standard,
Mhm.
and of course this would be a leather strap on the bare back, 30
Yeah.
lashes. So nothing. This is not getting spanked with a hairbrush. This was
Mhm.
a terrible kind of beating, and
Mhm.
there's a wonderful record I quoted in my book where uh, a group of native people from Mission San Francisco were apprehended. They had escaped from the mission. Had run away, and they were apprehended en masse and brought back. And they were interviewed about why they had run away. And the list of complaints that they gave almost all involved violence of one sort or another. Torture, punishment, deprivation. The other complaint was that the death of children from disease, which people blamed on the mission. People understood that the missions were not a healthy environment. So, but the policy of the missionaries was that once you had become a convert, once you had submitted to baptism, there was no turning back. You could not run away. If you ran away, we will go and get you. They claimed they never forced anybody to go into the mission, only forced them to stay. But towards the end of the mission career, in the 19th century, during those last years before the missions were secularized in the 1830s, plenty of missions were sending leather jacket soldiers out to just round native people up and bring them in and convert them en masse. Without
whether they wanted to or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I'm going to change gears here. I mean, obviously, the word is out on Father Serra now. He wasn't exactly with the dismantling of some of his memorials around the state, but there were people like that your book really revealed. That I was kind of surprised, and I'm just going to list a couple of them, but there's one that I wanted you to talk about. I'm thinking about, first, Thomas R. King was, he was pretty prejudiced. I read, and then there's John Muir, who I was kind of heartbroken to hear was prejudiced. But on a different note, there was somebody who I always thought was evil, who actually did some good for the state. And we're jumping ahead to the 20th century, and that's Earl Warren. And I grew up in the shadow of this, Earl Warren statue with the COVID mask on there. But Earl Warren, of course, is well known within the Japanese American community as being a proponent of internment, not only a proponent, but a strong supporter and advocate for Japanese American internment. And he did other things that were, I would say, not in line with my political views, but he also did some things that were more along the lines of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt would do for California. So I think he kind of gets a bad general rap a little bit. And I'm trying to be compassionate here toward his legacy. So if you talk a little bit about,
sure,
Earl Warren.
I must agree with you, Michael, that in some ways, Earl Warren was the big surprise for me in the book. Like you, I was familiar with, two things about Warren I was familiar with, and they didn't work together very well. One was that he was Attorney General of California in 1942 and was an enthusiastic supporter, in fact, perhaps the cheerleader for a policy of internment of Japanese. The other thing I knew about Earl Warren was that he was Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Warren Court, which has strengthened the interpretation of the 14th Amendment and provided all kinds of rights for Americans that would not have been obtainable otherwise, not least of which Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation of American education. So these two things didn't really work together for me very well. Now, the connecting tissue between the two of them is Earl Warren's 3 terms as governor of California. 3 terms. I didn't finish the 3rd term because Eisenhower appointed him to the Supreme Court. President Eisenhower appointed him to the Supreme Court. But he was, Jerry Brown was also elected to 3 terms, if you count all of his terms. But Earl Warren was elected to 3 successive terms. And he did a thing that will mark him forever as one of California's most important governors. During World War II, when state tax revenues were way up because corporations were making weapons and airplanes and ships, making money hand over fist from the federal government and paying California's state tax, corporate tax, and tax revenues were going way up. Instead of lowering taxes the way the Republicans wanted Warren to do, he created a rainy day fund. He said, we need that for post-war conversion. It's not always going to be so good, he said. And he prepared Californians for what he thought would be an inevitable economic decline after the war. Now, it turned out the Cold War started up pretty quickly and military production never really ended. And so California kept on booming pretty much. But he used that rainy day fund to help jumpstart massive support for improving education in public education in California, expanding the university and state university system, providing cheap mortgages for homeowners, beginning the construction of the freeway system, so in transport, in education, and he also proposed single-payer health care, which his Republican fellow Republicans were able to defeat. But Warren flummoxed. Both the Republicans thought he was a New Dealer, and the Democrats thought that he was stealing their issues. But he found a way to walk down the center line. And to his credit, when the Supreme Court, in a mixed decision, essentially declared internment illegal, Warren immediately shifted position to welcoming the internees home. Now, he later was during his, after he retired as Supreme Court justice, he was a graduate of Cal, of UC Berkeley, and he was like an alumni, super alumni, the mother of all alumni, and he called all the games. And he was on campus, and a group of Japanese students confronted him and demanded that he apologize, and he refused. He said, "That's history." But then in his memoirs, he admitted that he had made a mistake, that he had supported the wrong side on internment. Of course, this is after it came out that there was no security risk, no Japanese American was found guilty of espionage. There was, it was all a crock. So, hey, he was a man with failings, like all of us are. He once said, people don't understand, he said, the difference between what I consider to be politics and what I consider to be justice. He said, in politics, it's always trying to settle for the best you can get. And that means you have to compromise. And sometimes you have to do things you don't want to do. But justice is about principle. And when it comes to principle, there can be no compromise. So that was the way he drew the distinction between his political career and his career as a Chief Justice. But the fact remains that he created the modern California state government, which was then expanded on by Pat Brown and attacked by Ronald Reagan. So, in the 20th century, in the modern history of California, Earl Warren has to go down as one of the architects.
Well, I think you wrote him, you gave him justice. Wow, being unbiased on that, and I do appreciate that. It's ironic though. I have to mention a personal thing that my grandfather was arrested by the FBI based on a tip from a Cal Berkeley professor. And he was separated from the family for 2 years in a separate prison camp. So I just, this whole connection, and I'm seeing all these connections here. And one that completely escaped my radar, which he became my favorite person in your book, was Bret Hart.
Yeah.
I wasn't really aware of Bret Hart, who Bret Hart was. I vaguely remember reading um, about him, but I just recently read, after reading your book about the luck of, what was the title of that story? The luck of Roland. Oh gosh, now I can't remember. But it was essentially the saddest story I've ever written.
No, you said a story you've ever read?
Yeah, it was the saddest story I've ever read. And The Luck of Roaring Camp, that's the one.
Yeah.
And it is an extremely sad story. But this gentleman, who Mark Twain of all people called him the quintessential voice of the Western United States in the 1800s, and he had this. It's what was it? The Overland Trinity. Is that what they called it?
Well,
Uh,
the Overland was
Go ahead.
a literary journal that he edited.
Yeah.
The Overland
Yeah.
Monthly. And
Monthly.
he edited it. He had two colleagues who edited with him, Charles Stoddard and Ida Coolbrith. And the three of them were known as the Trinity. They were very close friends. And Ida Coolbrith was a poet. She published poems in the Overland Monthly. Charles Stoddard was a poet, not a very good one, and an essayist. And he was a very good essayist. And Bret Hart, and you're citing Mark Twain here is important because Mark Twain is the most famous example. He's the exemplar of that, distinctively American style of writing about ordinary people in their ordinary voices with their ordinary trials and tribulations and finding poetry or meaning in those, so Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain. But Mark Twain learned his chops from Bret Hart.
Okay.
Bret Hart really originated that form of writing. And The Luck of Roaring Camp, of course, as you say, it's a very sad story, but it's really an extended joke, a black joke. The miners were all sentimental. They raised this orphan child, the orphan of an Indian woman, a prostitute, and they named the child Luck. And they believe that everything is about luck. Everything is about luck. You find gold, you strike it rich, and so they named the kid Luck. And in the story, there's a flood, and the flood wipes out the camp, and Luck is killed. Bad luck. So it's and that story made Hart a national celebrity. It made everybody cry. You're crying. You're finding this meaning in this ordinary story about these hard-boiled miners and an orphan baby. So Hart and his two colleagues are really fascinating characters. This was in the 1860s. And the early 1870s. Charles Stoddard, turns out, you read his essays carefully, he was a homosexual. And he wrote about it pretty openly in the Overland Journal, in the Overland Monthly. And Ida Coolbrith was a feminist, and she pretty much wrote about that in her poetry. So you get these characters, I call them bohemians in 1860s California, who dare to think differently, who dare to think about a different way. And because that's one of the joys of California, isn't it? The history may contain a lot of stories that we would prefer not to have to remember. On the other hand, it also contains a lot of innovation and striking out for the territory in a different kind of way. Are sources of real joy.
Yeah, it started it. It was interesting. I think you might have wrote that he was admitted homosexual before the word even existed,
That's right. Exactly.
and he had wrote a story about his experience in Hawaii.
That's
And
right.
I think considered the father of gay. He's like the father of gay literature.
In some
And
ways, he is.
and
Yes,
cool,
that's right.
yeah, yeah. And Coolbrith, wasn't she a descendant of Joseph Smith or something like
She
that?
was. She was. She was. She was his niece.
Oh my
And
goodness! So
I actually, I tell you the truth, I, I'm seriously thinking about writing more about Ida Coolbrith because her
yeah.
story is so improbable. She was born a Mormon. Uh, then they, a niece of Joseph Smith. Then they left the church. They moved to Los Angeles. There's a whole Los Angeles story, which I actually tell in my other book, Eternity Street, where she marries a
I'll
man
get
and they
it.
have a terrible divorce, and she flees to San Francisco where she meets Bret Hart and Charles Stoddard and becomes a poet and an editor. Uh, Unfortunately for Ida Coolbrith, she's unable to support herself eventually. Her sister dies. She takes in her niece and nephew. She needs to support them. She becomes the Oakland librarian
Mhm.
and travels across the ferry every day to work 10 hours a day in the Oakland library. Pretty much ends her poetry career until she
Mhm.
retires from the library, and then she gets back to writing poetry again. Uh, but just a fascinating character, like so many of the characters in my book are.
Yeah, and oh, before I forget, the quote you have from Mark Twain is wonderful. I'm going to read it here. That though I am generally placed at the head of my breed of scribblers in this part of the country, the place properly belongs to Bret Hart. And you know, thank you for bringing him to my attention because yeah, I'm going to start reading. I want to read about these three, and so thank you. But in that sense, in your book, there were so many great small characters, as you say, like Eliza Tibbet, you know, the founder of the Naval Orange, Norman Singh, which is Sang Yuan, his eloquent letter about being Chinese foreign born in California. Little things like Fire Chief Daniel Sullivan from San Francisco. He complained of there there wasn't enough water pressure at the turn of the century. And sure enough, the fire pretty much destroyed San Francisco more than the actual earthquake did. And he unfortunately perished in the very same earthquake. And how were you able to add all these people together and make them? It's mind blowing.
Well, again, I think, uh, I mean, I was deliberately on the search for characters who could carry the story. And
Mm.
so, when I found them, it was always a joy. Uh, but I mean, I'll give you an example. Uh, the chapter in which internment takes place. Uh,
Mm.
I was looking around on the internet and I found a site, a blog, where an individual had posted a student newspaper from a high school in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles in
Mhm.
December 1941. And there was an editorial in this newspaper written by a ninth grader by the name of Marilyn
Yeah.
Green.
Mhm.
And she says in that, Christmas season is approaching. This is, of course, after December 7th, 1941, after Pearl Harbor.
Mhm.
And she said,
Mhm.
Christmas season is approaching, not the way we would have liked, she says. She said, and at this season, my heart goes out to our citizens of Japanese ancestry.
Mhm.
Now, at the same time, in the LA Times, people are writing about Japs need to be rounded up and
Mhm.
incarcerated in the desert, and we shouldn't care about what they think. We should give them the worst time possible. But
Mhm.
Marilyn Green, who had gone to school with, she was Jewish. She had gone to school with Japanese kids. She had gone to school with Mexican kids. She had gone to school
Mhm.
with Polish kids. She had gone to school with black kids at Hearst High School. I mean, her junior high school
Mhm.
was multicultural. They had a
Mhm.
multicultural curriculum at that time in Los Angeles about, it was all
Yeah.
about Pan Americanism and the diversity in the world. And she took her history and social studies lessons seriously, took them to heart. And one of the really cool things was that I got interested in her, and I dug around and I found one of her grandsons, and I talked with him on the phone. And he was able to
Uh-huh.
supply me with more information about her. So she wasn't just a name on a school newspaper. She became a real living
Uh-huh.
person. And I discovered that, and then of course you can look her up on, using Ancestry and whatever. And uh,
Mhm.
she graduated from high school. She married a Jewish boy from the West Side who was a veteran. They raised a
Uh-huh.
family together, lived in LA, post-war LA. She talked to her grandson about the days during World War II and how exciting it was in Los Angeles. And so,
Mhm.
again, to go back to the part of the book that I read at the beginning, that's what I mean by historical empathy, that you begin to
Mhm.
reconstruct the real lives of people and their fullness and the way that maybe the way they felt. Not only
Mhm.
that they lived, but that they felt, that they breathed, that they thought, that they laughed, that they cried, that they struggled. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think those are rare things to be able to find. And I was just very glad when I would come across a little detail like Marilyn Green pleading
Mhm.
for our citizens of Japanese ancestry.
Mhm. Along that lines, I have to mention Kosaburo Baba and about the Japanese and Mexican labor movements combining at the beginning of the 20th century. That's actually Oxnard, the Japanese cemetery in Oxnard, which has a lot of those farmers buried in there. It's a nice little cemetery, but things like that added up. Um, we've got a couple more minutes here, and I wanted to ask you. Actually, a viewer wanted to ask: was there any person that you were really surprised about, or that you found that you didn't really know about? I mean, you're an academic and everything, but was there a diamond in the rough for you in writing this book with all these wonderful little stories about people?
Gosh, uh, there's in a way there's so many of them. We've talked about a number
Mhm.
of them already.
Mhm.
Uh, One of the things that I mean, I knew about these people, but I didn't know their story quite in the way that I learned it doing the book. And that's that in right around 1820, three young men, Californios, natives of
Mhm.
California, Hispanic, they
Mhm.
were all sons of military officers, uh, were all in school together in Monterey. And they were picked out of the classroom by the governor of the state, who was, of course, in Monterey, and
Mhm.
he helped them. They were the smartest kids in their class. Alvarado and Vallejo and Castro,
Yeah.
and the three boys were then mentored by the governor of the state and given things to read. And he gave them classics. He gave them Don Quixote, and so they improved the reading, and they became the three most important California leaders of the
That's
1830s and
right.
40s. Uh, Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, Juan Batista Alvarado, and
Mhm.
Jose Castro, uh, and
Mhm.
they these are these were the leaders. They only had 25 years before the Americans came in and took over California, uh, from their youth until their demise. But they had a plan for California. They had aspirations for California. They wanted to lead California as a state. Uh, uh, and Vallejo himself advocated becoming one of the United States. I mean, there's although as I say, I knew about these individuals, I never knew that they were this close, that they were three boys who had grown up together, who knew each other all their lives and became, in some ways, political allies and at times political opponents. But there they were in school together, being tutored by the governor of the state. So, or the governor, it was a department at the time. That to me was a revelation. I really didn't know anything about that.
And it goes around to the point of our whole book about the small little stories. People can do really great things.
Yeah.
And they were like the perfect example of that. Okay, I have one more question for you. Is being a native Californian, living most of your life here, and then before moving to Connecticut, was this a labor of love for you?
Oh, absolutely. California is in my blood, and I think as in some ways my whole career has been directed toward this moment of actually writing a book that tries to tell the truth about a place that is shrouded in myth of all sorts of myths. So I try to be truthful. And being truthful, it's going to be nasty. It's going to be upsetting. But being truthful also means finding the humanity in it all, finding the ordinary people and the lives that they lived and the way that they made California come to life in their own time. I've been doing the history of the American West, frontier, borderlands for all of my career. And I think in many ways, California is the ultimate borderland, the ultimate frontier, the last of the American West.
Well, you wrote a wonderful book, and I thank you for writing this, and I thank you for taking the time to talk to us here in our audience at Chaucer's.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
My pleasure. And I'll leave you with this last photo. This is a photo of my uncle, Mamo, who's still alive, right? And it was taken by somebody you wrote about, Dorothea Lange. So here's a photo of Uncle Mamo by Dorothea Lange. And so your work will continue to, let Dorothea Lange's, I hope your work continues to inspire and entertain as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.